Hi, this is Chris with Nightfall Audiobooks, and I have for you something a bit different today. Thrift Store Horror is my collaborator on the channel. I use them for resources on what to read next and how to get books that I'm missing. And in some cases, I'm tracking down the wrong book entirely because it's the UK release and I already have the United States release. Anyway, recommendation was 13 Tales of Horror by 13 Masters of Horror. This is a compilation novel. It's all short stories. I have not read this before, but it came highly recommended by Thrift Store Horror. So we have stories by R.L. Stine, Caroline B. Cooney, Christopher Pike, D.E. Atkins, A. Bates, J. Bennett, Carol Ellis, Diane Ho, Lael Littke, Sinclair Smith, J.B. Stamper, Ellen Emerson White, and Patricia Windsor. Half of these authors have worked with Scholastic and Point Horror in the past. This should be pretty fun. And we all know about R.L. Stine and Christopher Pike, right? Believe it or not, I haven't really read any Diane Ho, or Sinclair Smith, or Caroline B. Cooney, but I do have a Cooney novel in the works, so stay tuned for that. I will be reading one story from this compilation and then publishing that as its own episode. I'm going to use this book like glue. If there's any holes or gaps or weirdness going on in my schedule, I'll be using one of these stories to fill that void. Just something fun to do. So let's begin. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can write me an email, nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I am also on YouTube at Nightfall Audiobooks. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the join button to show your support. I also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/nightfallaudiobooks. So tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me narrate them a story. Thank you very much for listening, and let's begin. Welcome to a Nightfall Audiobooks production of House of Horrors by J.B. Stamper, from 13 Tales of Horror. Mark stared at his reflection in the mirror and, for a moment, was startled by what he saw. His face was deathly white with black shadows under his eyes and cheekbones. His dark hair was slicked back off his forehead like a shiny black cap, and when he smiled, remembering that he was supposed to look like this, he saw the fangs that he had capped onto his teeth just an hour ago. "Mark, shape up," a voice yelled from across the room. "They'll be coming in soon." Mark turned away from the mirror to look at Elliot, the head usher, who was smirking at him near the entrance door. Elliot's handsome face was distorted by the scar he had drawn across it, but the girls who came through the House of Horrors still stared at him wistfully and giggled nervously when he made eyes back at them. Mark never got more than a quick glance at his thin face and awkward body in his black usher's uniform. Mark snapped his mind to attention as the heavy oak doors of the House of Horrors slowly began to creak open. As they did, he heard the familiar music start out from the speaker system. It sounded like the soundtrack of a horror movie, and still made an uneasy shiver crawl down his spine. He waited in the shadows of the room for the people to pass through the doors and begin their tour. One by one they walked into the entrance hall, their faces lit by nervous anticipation. Predictably, they all jumped as a flash of lightning seemed to cut through the room and thunder rumbled over the loudspeaker. Then Elliot began his smooth welcome to the House of Horrors, warning them to watch for the dark shadows and lurking terrors of the rooms. Mark watched with envy as the faces of the girls turned to watch Elliot, and their eyes fixed on his rugged features. Then he heard the high-pitched, eerie scream on the soundtrack, his cue to speak to the group. "This way, ladies and gentlemen," he said in his deepest voice. "Follow me into the sitting room." The crowd of people stared at him expectantly for a moment, and then began to walk through the entrance door that he held open, motioning them through with his flashlight. A blonde girl who had bravely walked into the sitting room first now screamed so loudly that the rest of the group huddled closer together, smiling nervously as fear flashed in their eyes. Mark pulled shut the door and walked after them into the dark sitting room, where spotlighted wax corpses were sprawled on the chairs and sofas in various grotesque postures of death. The tourists began murmuring and gasping as they moved along the railings of the sitting room. Mark tried to avoid looking at the corpse that bothered him most, the thin young man who seemed to have 4 puncture wounds in his neck. But, as always, his eyes gravitated to his face, twisted in a horrible death spasm. He pulled his eyes away and checked to see if any sightseers were straggling in the shadowy darkness of the room. There was only one girl who jumped in terror as he tapped her shoulder and told her to move on. Mark's hands began to tremble with anticipation as he reached for the door that led to the next part of the House of Horrors, the library. He opened it and motioned the crowd through, peering into the room to catch a glimpse of the library tour guide, Lisa. She was staring back at him with her dark eyes heavily lined with black makeup. Her blood-red lips curled into a suggestive smile. Then, like a cat, Lisa slipped through the shadows to Mark's side. "Party tonight, Mark," she whispered into his ear. "After hours. Don't be late." Mark felt his heart begin to pound against his ribcage as he breathed in the smell of her heavy perfume. She gave him a last, long look with her liquid brown eyes, and then slipped off into the darkness of the library, where waxen readers sprawled dead with faces frozen in masks of terror. As the last tourist of the group walked into the library, Mark slowly pushed the door shut, reluctantly closing out the sight of Lisa. He suddenly felt dizzy with excitement. After weeks of working in the House of Horrors, and being ignored by the other guides, he was finally going to go to a party with them, after hours. Never had a day's work passed so slowly for Mark. As each group of tourists moved from the sitting room into the library, he would meet Lisa's eyes. Each time, she smiled back at him, seeming to suggest that she too couldn't wait until the long day was over and the party would begin. Finally, Mark saw by his luminous watch dial that it was 8:45, 15 minutes until closing time for the amusement park. There would be just one more group going through the House of Horrors. Then the spotlights would be turned off, the doors to the building would be locked until the next day, and the guides would go home for the night. Suddenly, Mark wondered how the guides could have a party after hours without being caught by Mr. Hiller. He was a tough-minded manager of the House of Horrors, and he never let any of the guides step out of line. Then, just before the last group of the day came through the oak doors of the entrance hall, Elliot pulled Mark aside. "Did Lisa tell you about the party?" he asked. Mark grinned and nodded his head, suddenly liking Elliot for the first time. "Just make sure Hiller doesn't see you," Elliot said in a low voice. "As soon as you usher through this last group, hide behind the sets in the sitting room somewhere and stay hidden. Hiller comes through every night with a flashlight, checking to see that nobody damaged the wax figures. When he finally leaves, we all come out." Mark was about to ask where'd they meet, but the oak doors began to creak open, and Elliot rushed away to his post. As the eerie music started up for the final time that day, Mark felt a chill run through his body. Suddenly, he realized that tonight might not be all fun. To go to the party would mean risking his job, but it would be worth it, Mark told himself, thinking of Lisa's eyes and perfume. It would be worth it. Mark felt his heart pounding as he motioned the last group of visitors through the sitting room. This group was wild and giddy and screaming at everything they saw. Mark's nerves were on edge by the time he opened the door to the library and saw Lisa staring at him, her lips curled into a tantalizing smile. As the last visitor walked by, Lisa came up to him and ran a finger down his cheek. "It won't be long now," she whispered. Then she floated away into the shadows of the library. Mark's knees had gone weak, and his heart was beating even faster. He shut the door between the library and the sitting room and then shined his flashlight around the dark corners of the room. Usually at this time of night, he quickly made for the exit of the House of Horrors, along with the last group of tourists, and then hurried home. Suddenly, he realized that he wouldn't have a chance to call home to say he'd be late. His mother would probably worry, but Mark wouldn't miss this party for anything. Mark stepped over the railing that kept visitors from going near the sets of the sitting room. He found himself only inches from the waxen heads of two women who seemed to have died of fright. With a shudder, he crept into the shadows behind them, shining his thin light at the velvet curtains that made a backdrop for the sets. Mark realized he'd never thought about what was behind those curtains before, and now he had to find out. Hesitantly, he pulled the edge of the curtain aside and aimed his light behind it. There was a scurrying sound, like a rat on the floor. Mark jumped back and looked for someplace else to hide. But behind the curtains was the only concealed place in the room. He hesitated to step into their mysterious darkness, but then he heard the door from the entranceway begin to open. Quickly, he slipped behind the curtains, and then froze as a switch was flicked and the room was flooded with light. Mark looked down at his watch. It was just 9 o'clock. Hiller must have walked into the room, starting his nightly rounds to close up the House of Horrors. Shifting his head slightly, Mark peered through a narrow opening in the curtains and saw the manager walking along the carpeted aisle, carefully inspecting each of the waxen figures and peering behind pieces of furniture. Mark felt as stiff as one of the wax figures by the time Hiller had finished his inspection, switched off the lights, and walked into the library. Mark heard again the scurrying sound of a rat in the dark and felt its body brush against his leg. Holding back a scream, he pushed the curtains aside and ran across the sitting room set. In the dark, he bumped into one of the waxen figures, which felt strangely warm to his touch. Finally, Mark turned on his flashlight with trembling fingers and crept toward the edge of the set near the brass railing. He sat down and flicked off his light again. Now all he could do was wait for Hiller to finish his inspection and for the party to begin. In the dark, Mark smiled to himself, thinking about Lisa hiding in the dark in the next room. He wondered if she was thinking of him too. He was tempted to sneak to the library door and open it to join her. Surely Hiller must be finished in there by now, but caution stopped him. Mark decided to wait for Elliot or Lisa or another of the guides to come get him from the sitting room. After all, they hadn't told him to meet them anywhere else. The minutes seemed to drag by like hours as Mark sat in the dark, his body tense and his senses alert. He tried to imagine where Hiller would be on the path through the House of Horrors. By now he must have finished upstairs and was walking through the last room, the dungeon-like cellar. Mark checked his watch and saw that it was 9:45. He shivered, suddenly realizing that the air conditioning had been turned up. He had heard that the building was made colder at night to harden the wax figures for another day under their spotlights. Mark stood up and began to pace back and forth on the red-carpeted aisle of the sitting room, wondering where Elliot and Lisa were. He pulled up the collar of his black usher's jacket as the air temperature grew colder and colder. Finally, at 10 o'clock, he decided to open the door to the entrance hall where Elliot must be waiting. Mark pulled open the door and shined his flashlight around the small room, expecting Elliot to jump out at him at any moment. But the room was completely empty, and its dark paneled walls had no hiding places. Feeling a stir of panic in his mind, Mark walked over to the double doors that the visitors came through. There were padlocks through the handles of each one, and when he pushed against them, they didn't budge. Cold fingers of fear crept around Mark's mind as he ran back through the sitting room into the library, no longer worried that Hiller might still be around. "Lisa," he shouted into the darkness. His voice echoed hollowly back at him, and then died down into the velvet blackness of the room. Mark stood perfectly still as another wave of fear washed over him. Either Elliot and Lisa were playing a game with him, or he had misunderstood what they'd said. In panic, he tried to remember their words. He was sure Lisa had said a party tonight, and Elliot had told him to hide until Hiller left. Mark let his flashlight move across the wax figures in the room. He looked into one grotesque face after another, and then suddenly held a light on a blonde woman whose beautiful face shone out of the darkness. For a second, he thought it was Lisa. The wax face had the same liquid brown eyes and full lips as she did. But then Mark noticed the 4 white fangs curving over the lips. With his flashlight playing on her face, the woman looked so real that Mark swore her eyes were staring at him, and her lips were moving in a mocking smile. With a shudder, he moved the light away from the woman's face, and ran from the library through the door that led to the dining room. "Elliot! Lisa!" he called out in a trembling voice. There was no answer, only the deep silence of the empty House of Horrors. His flashlight picked out the faces of the diners gasping for breath over their poisoned food. Mark began to run, faster and faster, up the stairs to the bedrooms, all filled with grisly scenes of death and murder. As he opened each door, he held on to a slight ray of hope that he would be greeted by the happy shouts of the rest of the guides having a party. But each room he looked into was empty, and finally, he had only the dungeons downstairs left to investigate. Mark walked down the creaking stairs, his shoes sounding on each of the old boards. The dungeon door loomed in front of him, his last hope. But when he pushed it open, he saw only darkness, a darkness that mocked him. Mark felt anger flood through his body like a hot liquid. They had set him up like a fool, Elliot and Lisa. There never was any party tonight. They had just wanted to trick him into staying on alone in the House of Horrors. They were probably together somewhere right now, laughing at him. Mark pointed his flashlight down onto the red-carpeted path that wound through the dungeon. Carefully, he avoided looking at the scenes of torture on either side of him. He only wanted to get to the exit doors and leave this place as fast as possible. Mark turned the last corner where the path ended abruptly in front of a set of red curtains. He pulled them back and pushed angrily against the doors that led out of the House of Horrors. They didn't budge against his weight. Mark beat on them with his fists and slammed his body into the doors. Finally, he accepted the awful truth. He was trapped inside the House of Horrors for the night. Mark slumped against the doors and held his aching head in his hands. Terrible thoughts flew like black bats in and out of his brain. In his mind, he went through the rooms in the house, one by one, trying to decide which he should spend the night in. The thought of each one disgusted him, but he knew that the dungeon where he stood was the worst of all. Slowly, like an animal wary of its predators, he crept back along the red-carpeted path through the dungeon, toward the stairway that led up to the bedrooms. Halfway through the dungeon, he heard a sound rise out of the darkness in front of him. It made his blood run cold with terror. Mark strained his ears, but the sound didn't come again. He tried to tell himself that it was another rat, but part of his brain refused to believe it. The sound had been human, like footsteps coming softly toward him in the dark. Mark began to run through the dungeon. flashing his beam of light from one side to another and glancing quickly at the twisted features of the wax figures. One face caught his attention. It was of the beautiful blonde woman with dark eyes and full red lips. Mark had never noticed her in a dungeon before. Hadn't she been in the library only a few minutes ago? Reaching the stairs, Mark stumbled up the steps on his trembling legs. He fell hard at the top, hitting his head against an iron statue of an executioner. For a moment he lay stunned on the floor, too confused to move. Then, through the haze in his mind, he heard the sound again, the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs below him. Mark scrambled to his knees and frantically searched for his flashlight. Somehow he had dropped it when he fell, and the light had gone off. He groped in the darkness, feeling for the flashlight, but it seemed to have disappeared into the House of Horrors. The sound of the footsteps was coming closer and closer up the stairs. Mark couldn't wait any longer. Stumbling forward, he ran along the carpet through the upstairs rooms. At the end of the hallway, he pressed his body against a wall, breathing heavily, and waited. The darkness felt as thick as velvet and was as quiet as a tomb. Slowly, Mark began to relax and breathe more regularly. It had been his imagination, he told himself, all his imagination. Then the sound of the footsteps echoed down the upstairs hallway. They were coming toward Mark, slowly but intently, through the darkness. Mark choked back a scream and began running down the stairs that led to the dining room. He heard the footsteps following him more quickly now. They seemed to be running, too. He forgot about a turn in the aisle and slammed his body into the brass railing. A cry of pain rose from his lungs, echoing in the vast, hollow room. Mark staggered back, dizzy with pain. Then he heard a laugh, a low, evil laugh, come out of the darkness. Fighting down the panic that was spreading through his body, he ran toward the door that separated the dining room from the library. Throwing it open, he rushed into the library and screamed, "Lisa!" His voice echoed back, mocking him. Mark ran toward the door that led to the sitting room, but before he reached it, he heard footsteps come into the library. They were steady and sinister and seeking him in the dark. As his fingers began to claw against the door, Mark felt warm breath against the back of his neck. Then a low, throaty laugh came from behind him in the darkness. Just as he began to scream, the sharp fangs plunged into his neck. Then Mark sank to the floor, another victim for the House of Horrors. The next afternoon, Lisa came into the library to begin another day's work. She wondered if Mark would show up. She couldn't wait to hear how scared he'd been last night. Shining her flashlight across the wax figures in the library, Lisa noticed that the woman with the long blonde hair was now in a new place, leaning over a body on a sofa. For a second, Lisa's heart seemed to stop. She was sure nothing had been there before. Walking closer, Lisa looked down at the wax figure of a young man whose face was twisted in terror. For a crazy second, she almost screamed. The figure looked just like Mark. But then Lisa reached out and touched the face, and all she felt was the cold smoothness of wax. This has been a Nightfall Audiobooks production of House of Horrors by J.B. Stamper. Hi, this is Chris with Nightfall Audiobooks, and thank you very much for joining me for my production of House of Horrors by J.B. Stamper. This was fun. I like this idea. This was the classic, popular kids are going to set up the unpopular kid to come to a party after hours, only to stand the poor kid up and make him wait the entire night locked in work. That kind of sucks. I feel for Mark. That's a shame. It really hurts when you have a crush on somebody and you put yourself out there and you're trying your best and it gets met with ridicule like this. It sucks and it's unfortunate. We've all gone through it. I don't think Mr. Hiller or Lisa or Elliot or anyone else that works in a House of Horrors knows that one of the wax figures is haunted, and it's not a vampire in a traditional sense. It did bite Mark, it did have fangs, but it also stole his soul and forced him to become a wax figure? I don't know, and the unknown is really scary in this story, because there's a lot that we don't know. We don't know what's driving the blonde lady forward. We don't know what she does when she captures her victims. Are all of the wax figures in the House of Horrors victims of the White Lady? On second thought, does Mr. Hiller know, and he just happily collects new wax figures and doesn't question why? Does it get colder at night after 9 o'clock into 10 o'clock? Because after 9 o'clock, Mark remembers that it gets colder in the House of Horrors. So does the cold activate the blonde lady, and then she comes to life, and then she's able to claim more victims? I don't know. It's a lot of fun to think about this stuff, though, isn't it? I recommend J.B. Stamper. This was great. for essentially going nowhere and being in only one set spot, this was a lot of fun for a story, and having all these questions makes it fun to ponder. So what should I read next? I don't know. Send me an email, nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I love seeing what you have to say. I really do. I am also at home right here on YouTube at Nightfall Audiobooks. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the join button to show your support. Any help is greatly appreciated. I really do mean that. I also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/nightfallaudiobooks. So tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me tell them tales of horror. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.